important, I think, Larry, for us to keep in mind as Americans that an attack such as this is an attack on all of us.
Is there any possible reason why someone would need or want that kind of weapon?
You know, you and I probably get in trouble for even talking about this because the NRA, which is a very powerful organization.
Plus,
when you have two candidates, one of whom exudes strength and less policy, and the other exudes more policy and less strength, strength often wins. When a candidate for president, such as Mr. Trump, doesn't like what the Washington Post reported on and stands up and says publicly, when I'm president, they'll have to pay a price for the way they covered me in the presidential campaign. Now, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, I think we can all agree that's not a healthy thing for the country.
All next on Larry King Now. Welcome to Larry King Now. We're in New York City, the place of my birth. My special guest, a good friend and one of the great journalists, Dan Rather, best-selling author. His latest book is titled Lessons from the Field. It's a pamphlet book. Everything I learned about life, I learned from reporting. It's available at www.mindbodynetwork.com, and all proceeds go to the Committee to Protect Journalism and Journalists, and we'll get to that in our next segment. What are your views about Orlando? I don't have to say anything more than that, do I?
Well, first of all, your heart goes out to the families who lost people, either killed or maimed. But clearly, it's important, I think, Larry, for us to keep in mind as Americans that an attack such as this is an attack on all of us. And that's the way I view it. There's been a hole in my heart, and I'd be surprised if nearly every American didn't feel the same way. But unfortunately, we can expect more of this, not less, as time goes along. And, you know, the late Ed Murrow, one of my journalistic heroes, had a great word during World War II. His favorite word was steady, steady. And I do think it's time for us to be steady, calm, but also asking ourselves, well, where do we go from here? What needs to be done? What extra steps can we take? What do we learn from this? It's an important time for the country.
We know the NRA is opposed to anything because they feel once you start, they're going to take away the guns. But right. Is there any possible reason why someone would need or want that kind of weapon?
Well, you know, you and I probably get in trouble for even talking about this because the NRA, which is a very powerful organization, doesn't like anybody really to talk about it. But, you know, I grew up in Texas. I grew up in a gun culture. I know about guns. I'm not an expert on guns, but I know about guns. And I refuse to believe, Larry, that we can't find some common ground. Look, you're not going to eliminate guns in this country. There's no way you're going to do that. What you can do is use common sense. And I refuse to believe that the NRA membership, the rank and file membership, the leadership might be something else, wouldn't agree that we can say, look, we disagree about 100 things about guns. But where are there one or two things that we can find common ground and agree on? And I'll give you an example. That there are gun laws, and if you enforce the gun laws better than we have been enforcing them, that will help. But many of those laws do not apply to the gun shows. And about 40%, it's my understanding, about 40% of the guns that are sold at the gun shows where there is no, for example, background checks. Something like that, it seems to me, common sense, we could reach agreement on. Also, I'd be surprised if we couldn't reach agreement eventually on some weapon, for example, the so-called, what used to be called a street sweeper shotgun, fully automatic weapons and the like. Gotta be a way to control it. At least those, when I say control them, limit the sale, military, police. It's that kind of thing. You know, we're Americans. Everybody loves the country. The people in the NRA love the country. Let's reach some common ground. And I would hope it's true, going back in time, that these hopes have not been realized. But when you have something like Florida, in the wake of something such as what happened there, is a good time to say, hey, can't we put aside our disagreements, as many of them as they are, and find one or two things that we can actually do?
You would think. You wrote on Facebook, I felt a shudder down my spine watching Donald Trump's fusillade against the press. This is not a moment to be trifled with. Were you shocked?
Yes. I paused only because, you know, I, like you, I've known Donald Trump a long time. And at one time, we got along pretty well. I eventually did a story he didn't like, and that pretty much split it. I respect Donald Trump in many ways. He's done a wonderful job with his family. I think one of the ways you judge a man's character and his being is to look at his family. He's done a very good job with his children and his family. But what prompted me to do that was when he began to ridicule individual press people for things such as one person who was trying to question him was physically challenged, and to ridicule that person and to attack individual press members on a personal level, and also to talk about how when he becomes president, if he becomes president, how he, Donald Trump, would punish such institutions as the Washington Post for how they covered him president. This is not the American way. This is outrageous. Now, I've dedicated my life trying to be an honest broker of information, play no favorites, pull no punches. But when he attacks the press in the way he did, in particular those personal attacks on the press, I thought it was time to speak up.
Does Orlando help him?
I think it does. I'm sorry to say, I think it does. You've asked me for my opinion, so I give you my opinion. I think it does because with people who already like him or are inclined to consider voting for him would say, we can't keep going on this way. I'll put this in quotation marks. And we do need to change. And Donald Trump, he exudes strength. Now, I know there are people watching, listening, say, what do you mean strength? This guy says outrageous things and he says vacuous things. But he's a big man physically, has a big voice. He tends to command any landscape that he occupies. He exudes a sense of strength. My experience in covering politics, when you have two candidates, one of whom exudes strength and less policy, and the other exudes more policy and less strength, strength often wins.
More with Dan right after the break. Hillary. There are a lot of people saying, well, what if something happens to her? What if an indictment? Joe Biden, the Democratic Party can do what it wishes. It's a private convention. We just happen to go there.
Right.
The Democratic Party could change its rules if something happens with her and nominate Biden.
Well, Larry, you and I have spent enough time around politics that we know overnight's a long time in politics. A week is forever. And we're talking about a convention that doesn't happen until late July and an election doesn't happen in November. Could any of these things that you just said happen? Yes, they could happen. I do not expect Hillary Clinton to get indicted, but no one should be surprised if she's indicted, at least for a misdemeanor, if you will. A lot of things can happen. Health issues come into play. It could happen with the Republicans. We call Donald Trump the presumptive nominee. There certainly is a possibility that the Republican convention would just say, listen,
they could change their own rules.
We change their own rules. And with the Democrats, same thing happen. But, the good book says the race is not always to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, but that is the way to bet it. So, and the way to bet this, it looks like Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee and Hillary Clinton will be the Democratic nominee. But as a reporter, you always keep your antenna out for some of these other possibilities, because what we least expect often occurs.
And your antenna has always been out.
Thank you.
Written some good books, and the newest is Lessons from the Field. Everything I learned about life, I learned from reporting. What prompted you to do this?
Again, to be candid, I wasn't sure that it would make a book. But as I read through it, it is true that I think I've learned a few things in a lifetime of reporting. I've been reporting for, pretty close to 70 years now, if you can believe that. And there are certain things I've learned. Some of them I didn't realize that I had learned them until fairly recent years.
Example?
Well, for example, how deeply one needs to be into gratitude, humility, and modesty. Let's face it, being on television doesn't lead one to, particularly when you're younger, to think about things such as gratitude, humility, and modesty. But as I get older and reflect on what I've learned, one of the things I've learned is the deep and abiding value of those three things, which I was taught by my grandmother and my parents at an early age. But television, as you know, Larry, when you perform on television, it's providing a kind of NASA-grade rocket fuel for the ego.
Sure.
And if you're not very, very careful, you become narcissistic. And it's all
We've
about,
seen it happen to some people.
We've seen it happen, and look, you're not my confessor, but sometimes I fell into that trap myself. So you asked for an example of the kind of things that I've learned. Also, some of the sayings that were popular in my family, that my mother was fond of saying, about yesterday, no tears, about tomorrow, no fears, which is a way of saying, deal with what's in front of you today. Don't try try to put yesterday behind you. That's, as Willie Nelson sings, yesterday is dead and gone. And don't be focusing too much on tomorrow or what's ahead. Take each sweet day as it comes. Now, you and I at our stage, you're much younger than I am.
Oh, much.
But, you know, it's true. Any day I wake up and I'm not looking at dirt, it's a great day.
Coming up, is journalistic integrity on the decline? Dan's thoughts when we come back. We're back with Dan Rather, a journalist. Everything I learned about life, I learned from reporting. So well said. Speaking about journalism, you learned all you did about life from journalism. With blogging, 500 channels, the diminished newspaper, the diminished magazine, are journalists relevant?
Yes, in some ways I think quality journalism is more relevant today than perhaps it ever has been. The internet has many strengths, and overall and in the main, I think its pluses outweigh its minuses. But for the kind of quality journalism that matters, the kind of quality journalism is important, is essential, we're in a strange period in which the old business model that would support, for example, first-class international reporting, which used to be called foreign news, deep-digging investigative reporting, the business model for that is faded in some ways and fading. Nobody has yet come up with a new business model, with very few exceptions, to finance that kind of quality journalism going forward. And I do worry about that. That's one effect of this new digital world, if you will. And let me pause and say, you and I agree, and I think most Americans agree, that independent, fiercely independent, when necessary, journalism is the red beating heart of freedom and democracy. Now, in the new digital world, the very idea that, well, journalists are no longer relevant, what does that do to the idea that you need journalism as a check and balance on power? And quality journalism, at its best, that's one of its most important functions, is asking the tough questions of people in power. And let's face it, there's a unique shortage of that right now.
When you last had your last sign-off on CBS Evening News, you said journalists should be willing to risk it all for the truth. Is the truth as important today as it used to be in your hero, Mr. Murrow's day?
It's every bit as important today as it's ever been. In some ways, I think it may be more important today, and here's the reason. It's harder today to get at the truth. As I think Oscar Wilde said, truth is rarely pure and never simple. Another way of putting that, the truth is hard to get to because people in power have learned and have more resources today to retaliate against the journalist or the journalistic enterprise. For example, you mentioned Donald Trump earlier. I want to come back again and say that, you know, this is not a partisan political statement, but when a candidate for president, such as Mr. Trump, doesn't like what the Washington Post is reporting on and stands up and says publicly, when I'm president, this is a paraphrase, but this is what he meant, they'll have to pay a price for the way they covered me in the presidential campaign. Now, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, a conservative, liberal, reactionary, or progressive, I think we can all agree that's not a healthy thing for the country.
That's almost saying what Nixon was thinking.
Well, I was waiting for you to raise the Nixon analogy, but I do think that there are echoes of the Nixon era in what we're going through now with this presidential campaign. And I just hope people think carefully about it. It's easy to forget what happened during the Nixon administration. Look, what we call for shorthand Watergate, in quotation marks. What was it? This was a widespread criminal conspiracy led by the President of the United States himself. Now, I'm not suggesting that either one of the present leading candidates for President of the United States would descend to that level. And it's hard to say, it's still hard for me to acknowledge it. The Nixon presidency was permeated by deceit and lawbreaking. Nobody wants to return to that.
How about, I notice more of today, I wonder what you feel about it. Today, because maybe of cable news and so many channels, there's more conjecture. You know, a plane goes missing and we did this, that, and all we know is they made a left turn. Yeah. But we have to keep conversation going. So when a story breaks, someone shoots up someone, we got to know all about them right away.
Larry, this is such an important point that you raised. And I do, as a lifetime journalist and one who cares deeply about our country, often think about this. We have moved from a period where newspapers came out every day, or the radio broadcasts were 2 or 3 times a day, newscasts were 2 or 3 times a day. With the advent of cable and satellite television and the development of CNN and all news networks, we moved to a period where there was a deadline constantly, a deadline every hour. Now we're at a point here in the digital age, in the second decade of the 21st century, where there's a deadline every nanosecond. There's airtime to fill all day long, every second, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Poor reporting.
And that leads to conclusion jumping, conjecture. And again, I don't accept myself in this criticism because it's part of the nature of what we're dealing with today, that the old journalistic creed, such as you trust your mother, but you cut the cards, which is a way of saying never cynical, but always skeptical. Such things as when big breaking news happens, you know that many of the first things you hear are going to be wrong. But the pressure is on today with nearly everybody in journalism. You don't have time to check it out.
Some channels say breaking news on every story.
Yes.
I don't understand that.
Well,
breaking news, the sun came up.
Well, yes. Breaking news, Larry King is talking to Dan Rather. Well, and this diminishes the coin of trust. When everything is breaking news, then nothing really is.
Nothing is breaking.
But I do think, Larry, and here I hope I'm not an old journalist kind of wearing spats to the office. I do think there's a yearning in the public for someone who will talk straight and who will say, folks, I know this is labeled breaking news, but to tell you the truth, nothing new has happened on this story for the last 48 hours. I will say, when the late, great Walter Cronkite was anchoring the CBS Evening News, this was in another era, but we would get into all day or hours on end coverage. And sometimes, Walter, with nothing new to say, would say, well, let's go to the White House and Dan Rather. Dan, what's going on there? I can't tell you how many times I said to myself, I never had the guts to say it on the air, Walter, there's not one damn thing going on here. Now back to you.
Coming up, breaking news, a game of If You Only Knew. Plus, Dan takes your questions. Stay with us for more breaking news. We're back with Dan Rather, the new book, Everything I Learned About Life I Learned from Reporting. You can get it at www.mindbodynetwork.com. We're going to play a little game of If You Only Knew. I'll just throw some things at you.
All right.
Prepared by the staff, our crack staff. What makes you laugh?
The mistakes I make and how stupid I can be.
You have a favorite curse word?
Yes.
I don't hear you use it much, though.
Well, I was taught not to curse, but as with many other things, I didn't always take to the teaching. I would say damn it is probably used more often than anything else.
What makes you angry?
Intolerance.
Me too. Music we'd be surprised you listen to?
Sousa marches.
I like Sousa marches.
Sousa's Semper Fidelis is my favorite all-time march, and the second movement of Semper Fidelis always moves me for reasons too complicated to go into.
Story you're proud of?
I'm pausing only because, look, I've been very lucky and blessed and have a lot of stories. I would say our coverage of Watergate and those crimes.
Most memorable experience in the field?
Walking into and out of Afghanistan just after the Russians had invaded in late 1979 and early 80.
You wore a disguise, right?
Yes. Had to stay alive.
Story you wish you'd reported on?
I have been to North Korea, but it's an underreported story, what's happened in North Korea. So I would say on a long list of places I wish I'd been in, stories I'd covered, that'd be one.
Biggest regret?
Not spending more time with my children when they were very young.
Me too. If you weren't a journalist, what do you think you'd be?
Probably an assistant football coach.
Who would you like to trade places with for a day?
What a good question. Larry King.
Good choice. I'll be you. Secret talent?
Secret talent. Well, I'm almost bereft of any real talent, so that's a challenge.
The talent is you have no talent.
No talent. I would say I can sing certain country music songs reasonably well, cowboy songs.
Something on your bucket list?
I'd like to interview the present Pope.
Me too. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
If you could travel, time travel, would you go back or forward?
Forward. Always forward. Full throttle forward.
Well, a couple of questions from viewers. Corey Anderson on the Larry King Now blog. Given the rise in social media, is it better to be first or to be right?
Always better to be right.
But the urge is to be first, right?
Well, look, let's don't kid one another. As a journalist, you learn early that accuracy and speed are shoulder to shoulder. But the question was, if you have to pick one, always accuracy.
At KJM 1016 on Twitter, what was the most difficult story you ever had to report? And how do you prepare yourself to report a tragedy to the nation?
Well, certainly 9/11 was among the most difficult stories I've ever had to report. And there's no one thing or any short list of things. I think the more experience you have, the better chance you have of, when the pressure's on, when it's legitimate big breaking news and a big tragedy. I can remember stepping up to the anchor chair at CBS at the time of 9/11 and saying to myself, yes, I did pray a little, God let me be at or near my best today. But I did say to myself, because I was, like most people, shaken by what was happening, but saying a version of, I've trained all my life to do this. I know how to do this. So step up and deliver.
One reason I'm proud to be a journalist is it's in your field.
Thank you, Larry.
Thanks to my guest, the incomparable Dan Rather. Be sure to check out his new ebook, Lessons from the Field, Everything I Learned About Life, I Learned from Reporting. It can be found at www.mindbodynetwork.com. And go to newsandgutsmedia.com for the latest on Dan's reporting. And you can find me on Twitter at King's Things. And from New York, I'll see you next time. On Larry King Now, iconic newsman Dan Rather.
It's important, I think, Larry, for us to keep in mind as Americans that an attack such as this is an attack on all of us.
Is there any possible reason why someone would need or want that kind of weapon?
You and I probably get in trouble for even talking about this because the NRA, which is a very powerful organization.
Plus,
when you have two candidates, one of whom exudes strength and less policy, and the other exudes more policy and less strength, strength often wins. When a candidate for president, such as Mr. Trump, doesn't like what the Washington Post is reporting on and stands up and says publicly, when I'm president, they'll have to pay a price for the way they covered me in the presidential campaign. Now, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, I think we can all agree that's not a healthy thing for the country.
all next on Larry King Now. Welcome to Larry King Now. We're in New York City, the place of my birth. And my special guest, a good friend and one of the great journalists, Dan Rather, best-selling author. His latest book is titled Lessons from the Field. It's a pamphlet book. Everything I learned about life, I learned from reporting. It's available at www.mindbodynetwork.com, and all proceeds go to the Committee to Protect Journalism and Journalists, and we'll get to that in our next segment. What are your views about Orlando? I don't have to say anything more than that, do I?
Well, first of all, your heart goes out to the families who lost people, either killed or maimed. But clearly, it's important, I think, Larry, for us to keep in mind as Americans that an attack such as this is an attack on all of us. And that's the way I view it. There's been a hole in my heart, and I'd be surprised if nearly every American didn't feel the same way. But unfortunately, we can expect more of this, not less, as time goes along. And, the late Ed Murrow, one of my journalistic heroes, had a great word during World War II. His favorite word was steady, steady. I do think it's time for us to be steady, calm, but also asking ourselves, well, where do we go from here? What needs to be done? What extra steps can we take? What do we learn from this? It's an important time for the country.
We know the NRA is opposed to anything because they feel once you start, they're going to take away the guns. But
right.
Is there any possible reason why someone would need or want that kind of weapon?
Well, you and I probably get in trouble for even talking about this because the NRA, which is a very powerful organization, doesn't like anybody really to talk about it. But, I grew up in Texas. I grew up in a